kaya.
Ilang minutes tayo mag-start?
We will give a cue.
Ilang minutes?
We will give you Julius. Kasi we're
Sige na
waiting.
lang.
May marami pang papasok eh.
Sige.
FYI,
Yeah, Sir Ped.
FYI, the live stream is already open. It's already
Okay.
running.
Yes. We're also live now at Facebook. Attorney Julius.
Ladies and gentlemen, the national anthem of the Philippines.
kababayan. Ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
A fount of your infinite
Yan.
knowledge, that they can share something worthwhile despite the limited time we have. They can channel all they know and share to us the beauty and truth of living as your child. We pray that you guide our participants, the seekers of your boundless knowledge, that they continue to persevere in the search and be worthy to share what they learned from today's session. Sanctify us, O Lord, not because we are worthy of it, but because we believe in your love and mercy, that at the end of the day, we can take home something that's amazing and meaningful. This we ask and pray in Christ's holy name. Amen.
Back to you, Attorney Julius.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, depending on your location. Welcome to this year's Maritime Law Association Forum. We are pleased to have you on board to discuss a very important topic. Indeed, the West Philippine Sea, pertaining not just to the Philippines EEZ, but all the maritime areas where the Philippines has sovereignty and sovereign rights and jurisdiction on the western side of the archipelago, has been, is, and will be for years probably a contentious issue given the contested claims there, not to mention the number of parties involved. This afternoon, we are honored to have distinguished speakers to talk about this important topic. Justice Carpio will deliver his lecture. Thereafter, Ambassador Gilberto Asuque will give his comments primarily from the diplomatic perspective. Regrettably, owing to recently imposed protocols, the flag officer in command of the Philippine Navy, Admiral Giovanni Bacordo, is unable to join us to provide the military or security perspective. Before we begin the discussion, let us listen to the welcome remarks from the President of the Maritime Law Association of the Philippines, Attorney Ferdinand Nage.
Thank you, Julius. And good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Board of Trustees and Executive Officers of the Maritime Law Association of the Philippines, I would like to welcome all of you to MARLAW's online forum on the latest developments on the West Philippine Sea. For the past months, tensions in the disputed territories on the West Philippine Sea have tremendously escalated due to the continued deployment and lingering presence of Chinese vessels in the country's maritime zones. And despite the various diplomatic protests by the Philippine government and the stern warnings from other countries, particularly from the United States of America, and just recently from the European Union, still Chinese vessels are maneuvering in the West Philippine Sea. In July 12, 2016, the South China Sea arbitration entitled Republic of the Philippines versus People's Republic of China is undoubtedly a landmark case for the Philippines, as the said arbitral award has made clear under international law that China's encroachment in our maritime zones embodied under the 9-dash line is illegal, and ruled very clearly that the absolute and exclusive right of the Philippines to explore and exploit the resources in its exclusive economic zone. It is on this premise that we, peace-loving Filipinos and freedom-fighting Filipinos, should understand very clearly the importance of protecting our territories and enforcing our sovereign rights with the said arbitral award under our Constitution and international law. Our forum today, with the help of our experts and renowned speakers, former Supreme Court Associate Justice Antonio Carpio, and MARLAW's very own retired Ambassador Gilberto Asuque, is intended to further and deepen our knowledge and understanding of the situation so that we could respond appropriately to China's activities in the West Philippine Sea. Also today, let me welcome the newest members of MARLAW. And for the information of everybody, we have about 500 online participants attending, while the others are also following us via Facebook Live. So again, enjoy the online forum and allow me to share this video clip about MARLAW.
First established in 1982, the Maritime Law Association of the Philippines, MARLAW, aims to nurture and promote camaraderie among maritime lawyers. With the compelling leadership of its executive officers, MARLAW has long been an advocate for disseminating important knowledge and discussing different trends and issues affecting the maritime sector. MARLAW gives all the local maritime players the power to ensure that each sector makes progress. It also focuses in attaining equality and social justice across different sectors in the country. On October 2, 2020, the organization sealed a partnership with Top-Notch Medical Board Prep Incorporated and the Phi Kappa Mu Fraternity of UP College of Medicine to organize a webinar that discusses the best practices to ensure the safety and well-being of maritime frontliners and passengers during a pandemic. MARLAW has developed with the maritime lawyers who are proud to be a part of an organization that represents not just their interests, but also the public good.
Thank you, President Attorney Ferdinand Nage. I am Attorney Julio Ciano, Officer of the Maritime Law Association of the Philippines and Managing Associate of the Del Rosario and Del Rosario Law Offices, your host and moderator this afternoon. Again, welcome everyone. For our main speaker, born in Davao City, Philippines, Justice Antonio T. Carpio was sworn in as member of the Supreme Court on October 26, 2001. Justice Carpio obtained his law degree from the College of Law of the University of the Philippines, where he graduated valedictorian and cum laude in 1975. He placed 6th in the 1975 bar examinations. He earned his undergraduate degree in economics from the Ateneo de Manila University in 1970. In his student days, Justice Carpio was chairman of the editorial board of the Philippine Law Journal of the UP College of Law. He was editor-in-chief of the Gaidon, the school paper of the Ateneo de Manila University. He also served as managing editor of the Philippine Collegian, the school paper of the University of the Philippines. Fresh out of law school, Justice Carpio went to private practice and founded the Carpio Villarasa and Cruz law firm. He was a professorial lecturer of the UP College of Law from 1983 until 1992 when he was appointed Chief Presidential Legal Counsel with the cabinet rank, Office of the President of the Philippines. Justice Carpio was a member of the Board of Regents of the University of the Philippines from 1993 to 1998. He was a member of the Technology Transfer Board of the Department of Industry from 1978 to 1979. He served as Special Representative of the Department of Trade for Textile Negotiations from 1980 to 1981. He was elected President of the Integrated Bar of the Philippines, Pasay Makati Chapter 1985 to 1986. For his distinguished and exemplary service to the Republic, Justice Carpio was awarded in 1998 the Presidential Medal of Merit by then-President Fidel Ramos. In 1991, Justice Carpio received the Outstanding Achievement Award in Law from the Ateneo de Manila Alumni Association. In 2002, he was also the recipient of the Distinguished Alumnus Award from the Ateneo de Davao Alumni Association. In 2009, he was conferred a Doctorate of Laws honoris causa by the Ateneo de Davao University. In 2015, he was named an Outstanding Alumnus in Public International Law by the UP Alumni Association, and on August 18, 2017, he was awarded as one of the UP Alumni Association's most distinguished alumni. In 2015, the Department of Foreign Affairs sponsored Justice Carpio on a world lecture tour on the West Philippine Sea dispute. Justice Carpio presented the Philippines' perspective on the dispute before think tanks and universities in 30 cities covering 17 countries. In May 2017, Justice Carpio published the book entitled The South China Sea Dispute, Philippine Sovereign Rights and Jurisdiction in the West Philippine Sea. Justice Carpio was chair of the Second Division of the Supreme Court and chair of the Senate Electoral Tribunal until October 26, 2019, when he retired from government service upon reaching compulsory retirement age. Last December, he was conferred the degree of Doctors of Laws honoris causa by the University of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Justice Antonio Carpio. Your Honor.
Thank you, Attorney Julius, for that very kind introduction. A pleasant afternoon to everyone. Thank you, MARLAW, for inviting me to this afternoon's discussion on the latest developments in the West Philippine Sea. I will start with the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, that was signed in November 2018 between China and the Philippines. This was an agreement to cooperate in exploiting, commercializing the oil and gas in the West Philippine Sea, and in particular, the gas in Reed Bank. This was followed by the signing of the terms of reference in August of 2019 between China and the Philippines. The terms of reference would implement the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU. I supported this initiative for three reasons. One, the first whereas clause of the service contract, because the MOU and TOR would be operationalized under the service contract system of the Philippines, and under every service contract of the Philippines, the first whereas clause would say, whereas the oil and gas belong to the Philippine government. And in Reed Bank service covered by Service Contract 72, awarded to Forum Energy, that is there in the first whereas clause. The gas belongs to the Philippine government. The second reason is that the service contract is governed by Philippine law, and we will be pretty safe if the governing law will be Philippine law. And the third reason is that this MOU and TOR would serve as a framework for a South China Sea-wide peaceful settlement of the dispute among the six Asian coastal states, because there are 6 states that have a dispute over the waters, the maritime dispute. So there was supposed to be 3 agreements: the MOU, the TOR, and the last agreement would have been the commercial agreement between China National Offshore Company and Forum Energy, the awardee of the service contract over Reed Bank. And that was supposed to have been signed last March 2020, but the signing did not happen. There was a pandemic. The meeting in Manila was not held, but it seems that there was no progress after that. And what I heard is that China wanted to change the governing law. The governing law for the commercialization of the oil and gas in the West Philippine Sea under the joint cooperation, the governing law would be Chinese law or some other law. That would be a deal breaker for the Philippines, because we do not want to diminish our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. If it were Chinese law, we suspected that China would award a service contract to Sinop over Reed Bank, and we have also our service contract to Forum Energy, and that will create a big problem because Sinop would be what we call namamangka sa dalawang ilog. Sinop would be saying, I am here because I have a service contract with the Chinese government and the Chinese law. And Sinop would also say, I am a subcontractor of Forum Energy, which is a service contract with the Philippine government. That will be very confusing. That will diminish our sovereign rights. So we are standing firm. We will not agree to a change in the governing law. And that is why that the MOU and TOR are in limbo right now. China has not made any effort to make any progress. And in the meantime, China passed the China Coast Guard law that was disclosed, publicized last February of 2021. This, I think, plays the last nail on the coffin of the MOU and TUR. Under the Chinese Coast Guard law, China authorized its Coast Guard to use force to fire on foreign vessels fishing or surveying or conducting any economic activity within the 9-dash line. That is the Chinese law now. And the 9-dash line, of course, encroaches on 80% of our EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. So China is saying any foreign vessel that conducts fishing activity within the 9-dash line or conducts surveying for oil or gas or for any other resources within the 9-dash line can be fired upon by the Chinese Coast Guard. And this Chinese law violates international law. Under the UN Charter, it is prohibited, it is illegal, it is outlawed for any state to settle a territorial or maritime dispute through use of force or threat of force. Under the UN Charter, any dispute, territorial or maritime, must be settled peacefully through negotiation, mediation, or eventually arbitration. But China has passed this law, and the Chinese have told us, never mind, we will let the law stand, we will not use it against the Philippines. In other words, China is saying, trust us, trust the Chinese Communist government not to use this law against the Philippines. Of course, we'll never agree to that. If they do not intend to use it against us, then they just repeal that law. That law violates international law. You know, in 1945, when the UN was established, the use of force to settle dispute was outlawed. Might was right, that was the old maxim. It is now right is might. A country cannot go to war to acquire territory or to annex territory or to settle a territorial or maritime dispute. That is contrary to international law, that is illegal. And that is why, since 1945, we have avoided a third world war. Before 1945, Europe, Africa, and the rest of the world were in perpetual wars. We have World War I, World War II, because of the principle that you can go to war to annex territory, and if you win, what you did was legitimate. Your war of aggression is legitimized if you win. And that was the reason why countries went to war and strove to win the war. But now you cannot do that under the UN Charter. You must settle your dispute in accordance with negotiation, mediation, or arbitration peacefully. And that is also embodied in UNCLOS. Under Article 279 of UNCLOS, it says there, disputes under UNCLOS must be settled peacefully in accordance with the UN Charter. And also under UNCLOS, there is a dispute settlement mechanism, which is compulsory, and you have to go through that. And ultimately, that requires compulsory arbitration. You have to settle your dispute through negotiation, mediation, and eventually to arbitration. You cannot use force or threat of force. But China is trying to change, to reshape international law, what China calls international law with Chinese characteristics. This is very dangerous because if nations can now use force or threat of force to settle a dispute, territorial or maritime, then forget about UNCLOS, because it will be might is right again. Countries will spend money to acquire warships, missiles, warplanes, because might will be right. And the world will be a terrible place to live in. That is why this Coast Guard law of China must be opposed by everyone. All nations of the world must oppose this because this is the first time that a nation, a member of the UN, United Nations, of the United Nations, has passed a law allowing itself to use force to settle a dispute with other states. This will change radically the rules-based international system. This has to be opposed by everyone. All countries of the world must oppose this because if China can do this, can use force to settle a dispute, and China is a nuclear power, then UNCLOS will collapse. And if UNCLOS will collapse in the South China Sea, there will be no UNCLOS anywhere in the world because Russia will follow suit because it's a nuclear armed power, and the smaller countries, the non-nuclear countries will lose their exclusive economic zones. So we must oppose this. This is a very important development that we must address. We cannot let this pass. We must understand the meaning of the Chinese Coast Guard law. And of course, after China passed the Coast Guard law, China sent its maritime vessels in Julian Felipe Reef. Now, Julian Felipe Reef is a submerged area, but it is within 12 nautical miles of Gerson Reef. Gerson Reef is a high tide, so it's land, it's territory. It has a territorial sea, which includes Julian Felipe Reef. Now, Gerson Reef is occupied by Vietnam. Vietnam occupied it in 1978, late 1978. But before Vietnam occupied it, we already claimed the KIG. In 1968, we made our claim, and we made the KIG part of Palawan. And in 1978, we passed 1596, PD 1596, delineating our claim that polygonal lines in 1596, PD 1596. So it's a disputed territory. We made our claim ahead. Vietnam is a latecomer to the Spratlys claim. But at present, it is occupied by Vietnam. But of course, under RA 9522, we still claim that because RA 9522 did not repeal PD 1596. RA 9552 says that with respect to the following areas, our claim, sovereignty, and jurisdictional claim will be governed by the regime of islands under Article 121 of UNCLOS. These are Calayan Island Group as constituted under PD 1596. So 1596 stays, the polygonal line stays, but we are not claiming everything within the polygonal lines. We do not claim all the waters or the features, high tide or low tide, because RA 9522 was intended to align our claim with UNCLOS. Because under UNCLOS, if it is a low tide beyond 12 nautical miles of a high tide feature, you cannot claim it as a territory. So we actually amended 1596 PD to align with UNCLOS without giving up our claim. We are saying now, we are still claiming KIG, all the high tide features and their territorial seas. But beyond that, we do not claim sovereignty. We are claiming EEZ. So it is not correct to say that we abandoned our claim to the Spratlys under 1596. Our claim remains, but we aligned our claim with UNCLOS. It is the same with the 9-dash line of China. The 9-dash line of China was invented by the Kuomintang in 1946, 1947. It was a claim only to islands within the 9-dash line. When the communists took over, the communists expanded the claim to everything within the 9-dash line, all the waters and resources. That would violate international law. So President Mao of Taiwan, when he was president of Taiwan, reinterpreted the 9-dash line. He said it is only a claim to islands and their maritime zones as recognized under international law. At that time, the territorial sea was only 3 nautical miles. Of course, now it's 12. And if the islands are capable of human habitation, they would be entitled to 200 nautical mile EEZ. So under the Kuomintang, as reinterpreted, as correctly reinterpreted now going back to the roots, the 9-dash line is a claim to islands within the 9-dash line and their maritime zones as recognized under international law. But China has not changed its interpretation. It claims everything within, and that's why it's against UNCLOS. We amended our claim under PD 5096 to comply with UNCLOS. And so, why is China interested in Julian Felipe Reef? Because it is only 50 nautical miles from Mischief Reef, very near. And Mischief Reef is the largest air and naval base of China in the Spratlys. Of course, Mischief Reef is part of the EEZ of the Philippines as ruled by the tribunal. Only the Philippines can put up a structure there, and the structure of China there is illegal. But China wants to protect their largest air naval base by securing Julian Felipe Reef, which is only 50 nautical miles. In the same way that China wants to remove Philippine presence in Ayungin Shoal. Ayungin Shoal is just 20 nautical miles from Mischief Reef. That's why they're waiting for a dilapidated Sierra Madre ship to just collapse because it's now rusting. Because Ayungin Shoal is very near Mischief Reef. So that's the reason why China is there in Julian Felipe Reef now, because it wants to secure Julian Felipe Reef. It's very near its air and naval base in Mischief Reef, the largest air and naval base of China in the Spratlys. China calls it their Pearl Harbor in the South China Sea. So there is also this, somebody wrote recently that the arbitral award negated or abrogated our claim that our territorial sea are enclosed by the Treaty of Paris lines. That's not correct. We amended under Republic Act 9522, our interpretation made it clear that we are not considering the Treaty of Paris lines as enclosing a territorial sea. Under Republic Act 9522, this Republic Act amends the baselines that determine the territorial sea, an act defining the baselines of the territorial sea of the Philippines. And we said our baselines are the archipelagic baselines. We adjusted our baselines to conform to UNCLOS, and we measure our 12 nautical territorial sea from these baselines. We are not following the rectangular line of the Treaty of Paris lines as constituting our territorial sea. We clearly abandoned that interpretation. That is in the decision in Magallona versus Ermita, which I penned, and it was a unanimous decision. We remove all doubts that our baseline are measured only from our archipelagic baselines in accordance with the UNCLOS. We totally rejected the claim of the petitioners, and one of the petitioners was Harry Roque, who is now the spokesperson. Harry Roque and Magallona wanted that our territorial sea be the waters enclosed by the Treaty of Paris lines. It will be just like the 9-dash line of China. In fact, when we were there at The Hague, one of the judges in the tribunal asked the Philippine lawyers, "You are questioning China's 9-dash line as contrary to UNCLOS, which is claiming everything within the 9-dash line. But you have your own 9-dash line, the Treaty of Paris line. You're claiming as your territorial sea, everything within the 9-line. We told the Philippine delegation, informed the panel that we have amended, we have a new law under Republic Act 9522, and it was affirmed by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said our baselines are the archipelagic baselines, our territorial sea will be measured from this baseline, so we are not claiming that the waters within the Treaty of Paris lines are our territorial sea. We completely rejected that in Magallona versus Ermita. So that's why in the award, in paragraph 223 of the award of July 12, 2016, it says there, the principal proponent of the concept of historic title in the course of the conference, that's the UNCLOS conference, was in fact the Philippines, which employed the term with respect to a claim which it has since abandoned, to a territorial sea within the lines fixed by the Treaty of Paris of 1898. They were saying we were the author of that historic title claim because we were claiming during the convention, during the negotiations, that with everything within the Treaty of Paris lines, all the waters there constituted a territorial sea. And the tribunal said the Philippines was in fact the author of this historic title concept, but which the Philippines has since abandoned because we showed to the tribunal the decision in Magallona versus Ermita. We have abandoned that claim very clearly. So I'm saying that because there was a recent article which says that the tribunal in its award abrogated our claim within the Treaty of Paris lines. No, we did not. Or that the tribunal abrogated our claim in the spat lists that we owned everything within the polygonal lines of PD 5096. No, we did not. So what is the problem now? Well, NAMRIA is supposed to come up with charts and maps showing the West Philippine Sea, our 200 nautical mile EEZ in the West Philippine Sea, but it has not produced a map it has come up with an administrative map of the Philippines with the West Philippine Sea, but you do not see any delineation up to where our EEZ is located. It just has the words West Philippine Sea, and that's all. And there is no indication what are the high tide features that we are claiming within the polygonal lines or the low tide features. NAMRIA must come out with the status of those features because we're claiming them as our territory. And we should separate those which are low tide from the high tide. And that is one of the problems now because we have been saying that Julian Felipe Reef is part of our EEZ. No, it's part of the territorial sea of Gerson Reef. So we really need the facts in the water, and NAMRIA should prepare the paperwork for this. So we go now to the verbal fishing agreement. This is now a topic. The president, in various occasions, said this started actually when a Chinese fishing boat rammed Genver, the fishing boat, Filipino fishing boat Genver 1 in Reed Bank. And President Duterte justified the presence of the Chinese fishing boat in Reed Bank by saying, I entered into a verbal fishing agreement with President Xi Jinping, allowing them to fish in the West Philippine Sea. That is why that fishing boat of China was there. And everybody was surprised. Nobody heard of a verbal fishing agreement with China. That was the first time that President Duterte disclosed that. And again, he reiterated this during the anniversary of the PSG in Malacanang. He said, I have an agreement with President Xi. Sabi niya, sa agreement namin, pwede tayo mag-fish dito, pwede sila mag-fish doon, para walang away. So that's our agreement. So he confirmed it. And when he delivered his SONA in 2019, he said, pwede mo bang sabihan si Prenze na huwag ka mag-fish dyan? Nobody can tell him not to fish. Besides, China has been there historically, traditionally fishing in the West Philippine Sea. That was his statement in the SONA before the entire Filipino people. And recently, after the swarming in Julian Felipe Reef, when they had that cabinet meeting, President Duterte said, ang agreement namin ni Presidency, pwede sila mag-fish pero hindi sila pwede kumuha ng oil and gas. Hindi pwede, wala yan sa agreement namin. So he again reiterated the fishing agreement. But a few days ago, the spokesperson, Harry Roque, said there is no such thing as fishing agreement. That's just speculation of critics of the president. That's a malicious invention of the critics of the president. So, well, of course, it cannot be denied. The president himself said several times, even his allies in the Senate, Senator Tolentino delivered a privileged speech defending the verbal agreement as valid under international law, citing the Eastern Greenland case between Denmark and Norway, that a verbal commitment undertaking is valid under international law. So that is a big problem, this verbal fishing agreement, because after Duterte is gone, and if the next administration will go to an UNCLOS tribunal to stop China from fishing in the West Philippine Sea, China will say, oh, we have a verbal agreement, and that is valid under international law. We have a verbal agreement with President Duterte. So how do we avoid this? Because this could bind the next administration. President Duterte should just say, okay, we had that agreement, but that will be good only during my term. After I leave office, that agreement expires. He has to say that now, because that will be a big problem of the next administration, because China will use this against us. That President Duterte admitted there is a verbal agreement that China can fish in the EEZ of the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. Of course, the EEZ of the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea is exclusive for Filipino fishermen. There is no traditional fishing in the EEZ. Traditional fishing is allowed only in the territorial sea or in archipelagic waters with the consent of the adjacent coastal state. Unless a coastal state will give fishing rights to another state in its own EEZ. And that is what Duterte has done. Without the consent of the Senate, you know, the right to fish exclusively in your EEZ is a sovereign right. And as a sovereign right, the president cannot give that away, cannot waive it, cannot abandon it without the consent of the Senate in a treaty. But the Senate did not continue with its investigation. So they just allowed President Duterte to continue with this verbal agreement. And that is because they were in their election of their duty to see to it that they have to ratify that kind of an agreement. So this is a big problem for the next administration, because we will be faced with this problem. So Duterte must now say that verbal agreement is good only while I am in office, and that will solve our problem. Now we go to another issue. In the last cabinet meeting that was televised, President Duterte said, China is in possession of the West Philippine Sea. China is in possession of the waters of the Spratleys. You can see Secretary Rosana stand up and respectfully telling the president, Mr. President, our Navy ships go to Pag-asa to resupply. They patrol Pag-asa. They patrol the West Philippine Sea. So he was rebutting his commander-in-chief. His commander-in-chief was saying, China is already in possession of the West Philippine Sea and the Spratleys, and we cannot go there. Lorenzana was saying, we are actually going there. It is not correct to say that China is in possession. this is not the first time that President Duterte said this. The first time he said this, that China is in possession of the West Philippine Sea, I objected, and Secretary Panelo tried to save the situation by saying, President Duterte is a Bisaya. So instead of saying position, he said possession. What he meant really that China is in position in areas in the West Philippine Sea. Of course, President Duterte ignored him. President Duterte again reiterated in his SONA that China is in possession of the West Philippine Sea. What is the meaning of this? This is a big problem because this is an admission against interest. And, admissions against interest, even a verbal, are binding on states. You have the Eastern Greenland case where the foreign minister of Norway verbally said, we will not object to the sovereignty of Denmark over the eastern portion of Greenland. And the tribunal said, you're bound by that. That's an admission against interest. And Duterte has been saying this from the very start. When he became president, he said, I am setting aside the arbitral ruling. To set aside the arbitral ruling is to abandon it, to revoke it. It's a good thing that the DFA, after I called up the DFA, I told them you have to clarify this because this is an admission against national interest under the doctrine of unilateral declaration. We are bound by this if China accepts it. Before China could accept it, the DFA made a clarification. What the president really meant was he will put it aside and raise it at a future time. A few hours after that clarification, China comes with a statement, we accept. Too late, we already clarified. But President Duterte continues to make these verbal admissions against national interest, that China is in possession of the West Philippine Sea. Physically, it's not true. You can just come, it's a good thing that the National Task Force on the West Philippine Sea came out with a statement, I think yesterday. They said they continue to patrol our EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. They will never give up the West Philippine Sea. So they are actually telling their commander-in-chief, hey, China is not in possession. And physically, China cannot possess the West Philippine Sea because these are waters. You can possess a geologic feature because you can stand there, put up a structure there, but you cannot possess the waters. You can only control it. And China doesn't even control the West Philippine Sea because of the freedom of navigation operations of the US and its allies. Every time the US and its allies conduct a freedom of navigation operation in the West Philippine Sea, conduct naval drills, they're telling the Chinese, hey, you do not control these waters. You do not own these waters. These are waters belonging to the exclusive economic zone of a coastal state in accordance with the Arbitral Tribunal Award. And there's only one coastal state in the West Philippine Sea, the Philippines. None of the ASEAN coastal states, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, are claiming our EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. They are claiming territories, islands, and their territorial sea. But they are not claiming the EEZ. That's very clear. Only China is claiming our EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. So we have a big problem. Our president is conceding more than what China is claiming. China is not claiming that they are in possession of the West Philippine Sea. They have not yet said that. But President Duterte is already saying China is in possession. So what do we do? The National Task Force on West Philippine Sea is correct. They said, we are patrolling continuously the West Philippine Sea, debunking the claim of their commander-in-chief. Everybody in the Philippines, the MARLAW, all the organizations in the Philippines, the schools must come out and say, China is not in possession of the West Philippine Sea. We must say that because otherwise China will use this against us. Very important. All organizations, all political parties must say, must come out, China is not in possession because that's factual. when the military conduct their flag ceremony every Monday, they must shout out loud, China is not in possession of the West Philippine Sea. Shout it loud so that President Duterte can wake up under his Colombo. He will wake up to hear it, that China is not in possession of the West Philippine Sea. We must strongly assert this, because one day China will, in an arbitration case, China will say, you conceded already the West Philippines to us. We must object, and the president must change his tune, because he is conceding something that China is not even claiming. So we go now to the support of the world community. Of course, the US and its allies, UK, France, Japan, Canada, Australia, they all sail in the West Philippine Sea. And this is the most robust enforcement of the arbitral award, because every time they sail and conduct naval drills, they're telling China, you don't own the waters. We can conduct naval drills here because this is an EEZ. In the EEZ, under UNCLOS, we can conduct naval drills. And of course, in the West Philippine Sea, there is only one coastal state that can claim an EEZ there, the Philippines. So the US and its allies are actually enforcing the ruling for us. And they do this every 45 days. Every 45 days, they conduct FUNOPs in the West Philippine Sea and in the South China Sea. And they are enforcing the arbitral award for us. Lately, Germany and the Netherlands said, we will also send our ships to sail in the South China Sea. And also lately, the US again clarified the meaning of the Mutual Defense Treaty. The US said that the Mutual Defense Treaty covers the South China Sea, because under the MDT it says the Pacific Theater. So the US said the Pacific Theater includes the South China Sea because that is a marginal sea of the Pacific Ocean. And any armed attack on Philippine forces in the South China Sea can trigger the operation of the treaty. So it's very clear now, if our military contingent in Pag-asa is attacked by China, any armed attack on our military contingent on Pag-asa, that will be covered by the treaty. We can invoke the treaty. Because there was a dispute before, because as we know, it's a mutual defense treaty. It's not a treaty to expand your territory. And there were doubts before that the Spratlys would be covered, because when the treaty was signed, the Spratlys were not yet incorporated as part of Philippine territory. That's why the US was always saying, we do not take sides in territorial disputes in the South China Sea, referring to the Spratlys. But now they have clearly said, any armed attack on Philippine military forces in the South China Sea, including the Spratlys, will trigger the operation of the treaty. So that's very clear now. So we should publicize this so that the Chinese will know that if they want to give the US a legal excuse to intervene in the South China Sea dispute, they should not attack our armed force, our military in the island territories that we hold in the Spratlys. Now, I just want to make clear that the ASEAN 5, you see there are 5 ASEAN countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and the Philippines, that are involved in this maritime dispute with China. So there are 4 others aside from the Philippines. None of these 4 countries are claiming our EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. I want to be clear with that. Our dispute with them is on territorial dispute, which is a different dispute. That's not covered by the arbitral award. There is no tribunal that has a compulsory jurisdiction over the territorial dispute. We'll be happy to submit the territorial dispute to voluntary arbitration, but if no country will agree, we will just wait for sea level rise to submerge everything in the Spratlys, because in 100 years, sea level rise will submerge everything. in the Spratlys, and all areas within 200 nautical miles from our baselines in Palawan would form part of our EEZ because that's the natural action of nature. So we just wait because in the end, sea level rise will run to the rescue of the Philippines. That will all form part of our EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. All those island territories in the Spratlys within 200 nautical miles. There is also this issue. Remember, we had Malaysia filed a note verbal objecting to our note verbal because our note verbal stated that we reject any claim of Malaysia projecting an EEZ from Sabah into the South China Sea. Well, that was a mistake because the territory of the Sultan of Sulu never faced the South China Sea. The territory of the Sultan of Sulu faced the Sulu Sea and the Celebes Sea, but never the South China Sea. So we cannot claim any EEZ from the territory of the Sultan of Sulu from Borneo. So there is no overlap, and we should not exacerbate this problem. There is no overlap between the EEZ of Malaysia and our claimed EEZ from the territory of the Sultan Sulu because the territory of the Sultans never faced the South China Sea. In fact, there's an opinion by the UP Law Center on this, that the territory of the Sultan of Sulu never faced the South China Sea. So what is now the status? Well, we are witnessing now a continuing support from the rest of the world for the enforcement, for respect by China of the arbitral award. More and more countries. The latest is the EU, European Union, issued a statement that China must abide with the 2006 award of the arbitral tribunal, saying that the 9-dash line has no legal effect. And this is a marked improvement because before the arbitral award came out, the EU was strongly supportive of the Philippine position. But after the award came out, strangely, the EU became very soft in its support. Why? Because of Greece. Greece was courting investments from China for its port of Piraeus. And so Greece watered down the statement of the EU supporting the arbitral award. But Greece now realized its mistake because Turkey is claiming that the islands of Greece in the Aegean Sea do not have an EEZ, that the EEZ of Turkey from its mainland covers all the islands owned or possessed now by Greece in the Aegean Sea. So Greece is now using UNCLOS to defend itself against this Turkish claim in the Aegean Sea. So it's a lesson to Greece. If you do not support UNCLOS, it will go back to you. You will suffer. And Greece now is not objecting to a strong EU statement. With that, I end my discussion. Thank you and a pleasant afternoon to everyone.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Justice Carpio, for that profound discussion on the topic. And it seems it's particularly interesting how you mentioned how the Philippines, as a member of the international community, has been adjusting or trying to comply with international law. And other countries, unfortunately, other states would not want to do what they are supposed to do to comply with their international obligations, particularly under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Your Honor, we have received a number of questions which we will pose to you and to Ambassador Asuke later on. Hopefully, you could address them. Thank you again, Your Honor. So for now, in lieu of the participation of our supposed speaker for the security from the security sector, we will just be reading the latest press statement from the National Task Force on the West Philippine Sea on the latest as regards to the West Philippine Sea. But before we go there, we would like to invite our attendees in this afternoon's forum to another forum on the 30th of April. It will be hosted by the Philippine Bar Association. We are supportive of their event. You see on your screen the advert for their event. So hopefully you could join them as well to have more information and more insights from their speakers. One of whom is the Honorable Justice Carpio. Thank you. Now, let me read the latest press statement from the National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea, which they just released. And I quote, "The National Task Force West Philippine Sea sustains sovereignty patrols in the West Philippine Sea. The Philippine government continues to patrol the West Philippine Sea in the exercise of its sovereignty and sovereign rights under the Philippine Constitution and international law. The Philippine Coast Guard, Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, and Philippine National Police Maritime Group are closely coordinating in the continuous regular deployment of vessels in the country's maritime domain for law enforcement, monitoring, ensuring the safety of the Filipino fishermen, and protecting the environment. Currently, the BFAR has deployed its monitoring, control, and surveillance vessels and multi-mission offshore vessels to the municipality of Kalayaan, strengthening regulations against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, protection of the marine environment, and enhancing the well-being of Filipinos dependent on this critical resource remain to be the priority of the government. These vessels are collaborating with ships and aircraft of the PCG patrolling the area. The PNP-MG, or Maritime Group, has also dedicated its high-speed tactical watercraft, police gun boats, and police fast boats ready to be deployed in law enforcement patrols. PNP-MG personnel will be posted to the municipality of Kalayaan and assigned as shipriders aboard PCG, Philippine Navy, and BFAR vessels. The area task forces have likewise dedicated naval vessels and military aircraft to conduct sovereignty patrols on rotational basis over the municipality of Kalayaan, Bajo de Masinloc, and the rest of the western seaboard. For the period 15th to 22nd April 2021, the PCG reported that there were no direct incidents between the Chinese Coast Guard and Filipino fishermen in both the municipality of Kalayaan and Bajo de Masinloc for the third consecutive week. An average of 20 Filipino fishing boats and service boats were monitored fishing within the territorial sea of Bajo de Masinloc. The area task forces, however, reported the continued illegal presence of 3 Chinese Coast Guard vessels in Bajo de Masinloc, 1 Chinese Coast Guard vessel in the municipality of Kalayaan, and 1 Chinese Coast Guard vessel in Ayungin Shoal. These incursions are under review for the possible filing of appropriate diplomatic actions. In response to the continued illegal presence of Chinese Coast Guard vessels, the PCG conducted maritime patrols in the municipality of Kalayaan and Bajo de Masinloc, coinciding with its ongoing maritime capacity building exercises, Task Force Pagsasanay. Our government shall not waver in pursuing peaceful, rules-based, and proactive initiatives on environmental protection, safety of navigation, maritime and food security within our maritime domains. We remind all stakeholders in the region of their respective commitments made in the 2002 Declaration of the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, and underscore the importance of diplomacy and sincere discussion and exploring areas of cooperation, especially on marine environmental protection in the area, lest we risk denying present and future generations the right to a healthy and sustainable environment." Unquote. So that's from the National Task Force West Philippine Sea. And now let me introduce our next speaker and reactor. Attorney Gilberto Asuque is a career Foreign Service Officer of the Department of Foreign Affairs. He has retired from the DFA in 2019 with the rank of Chief of Mission 1. He served as Philippine Ambassador to Lebanon from 2009 to 2011 and Philippine Permanent Representative to the International Maritime Organization and related intergovernmental organizations from 2016 to 2018. Ambassador Asuke served in various capacities in the DFA as Assistant Secretary for Maritime and Ocean Concerns from 2011 to 2014, spokesperson of the DFA from 2004 to 2006, Deputy Chief of Mission in the Philippine Embassy in Tokyo and Philippine Embassy in London, Consul General in Calgary, Canada, and in Tel Aviv, Israel, Executive Director of the DFA Maritime and Ocean Affairs Unit from 1994 to 1997, Director in the DFA Office of Legal Affairs, and in various capacities during his service in embassies and consulates general of the Philippines. Prior to joining the Philippine Foreign Service, Ambassador Asuke was a broadcast journalist and newscaster from 1972 to 1986. Ambassador Asuke is a graduate of the IMO International Maritime Law Institute in Malta with a degree on Masters in International Maritime Law and the University of Greenwich in London with a degree on Master in Maritime Policy. He is a graduate of the UP College of Law, batch of 1986, and the University of the East from 1974. Ambassador Asuke is a member in good standing of the Integrated Bar of the Philippines and board member of the Maritime Law Association of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all welcome Ambassador Gilberto Asuke. Ambassador, sir.
Thank you very much, Attorney Julius, for that introduction, generous introduction. Let me share my screen to everyone so we can discuss the issues as presented in this forum. First of all, former Senior Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Antonio Carpio, colleagues in MARLAW, participants in this forum, guests. I thank MARLAW for inviting me to this forum on the West Philippine Sea, which is the national conversation or discourse at this time as it involves Philippine sovereignty and sovereign rights. I recall my meetings with Senior Associate Justice Carpio sometime in 2012 to 2014 at the Manila Yacht Club, where the DFA was crafting its legal strategy against the creeping jurisdiction of China in the West Philippine Sea, after all diplomatic efforts were exhausted. The DFA then was left with the only peaceful option of bringing China to court under Part 15 of UNCLOS on compulsory dispute settlement. A number of sectors, including in the academic community, was very vocal in stating that the Philippines cannot bring China to court or arbitration under UNCLOS because the dispute involves territorial sovereignty and exceptions under UNCLOS, including Article 298 on optional exceptions. We had a number of discussions with Justice Carpio, who then submitted his white paper on the legal strategy in the West Philippine Sea. This paper was attached to a memorandum by then Foreign Affairs Secretary Albert Del Rosario to President Benigno Aquino Jr., and eventually led to the arbitration case in the Republic of the Philippines versus the People's Republic of China. The key element in that legal strategy was that we can bring China to court through an arbitral tribunal concerning its interpretation and application of the provisions of UNCLOS. The legal strategy was anchored on Articles 279, 286, 287, and 297 of Part 15, Settlement of Disputes under UNCLOS. The arbiter tribunal proceeded to hear the case despite the absence of China in the proceedings upon the express request of the Philippines to proceed under Annex 7, Article 9 of Default of Appearance, which states in part, absence of a party or failure of a party to defend its case shall not constitute a bar to the proceedings. On 13 November 2015, the Philippines, during the oral arguments, presented its final submissions composed of Parts A and B, with Part B containing 15 requests. The arbitral award is explained in 495 pages, including the photos, excluding the annexes. I wish to quickly discuss key points in the award, quoting from specific numbered sections and based on the Philippine submissions that are very relevant to the current situation in the West Philippine Sea, and its reference to how states, ASEAN, and other sectors frame their diplomacy in the South China Sea with the arbitral award as a benchmark. This would also put in context the earlier discussions by Justice Carpio. On the issue of jurisdiction, the tribunal declared it has jurisdiction to hear the case. The award shall be complied with by the parties to the dispute. On the 9-dash lines, the tribunal declared, quote, are contrary to the convention and without lawful effect, unquote, and that the UNCLOS, quote again, superseded any historic rights or other sovereign rights of jurisdiction in excess of the limits imposed therein, unquote, meaning the limits on the maximum distance from the baselines of the maritime zones. On whether the features in the South China Sea, such as the Scarborough Shoal and Pag-asa, are rocks or islands, the tribunal, citing Article 121, Paragraph 3 of UNCLOS, has concluded that high tide features are rocks and that none of the features in the Spratlys Islands is capable of sustaining economic life or human habitation of their own and shall have no EEZ or continental shelf. In other words, these high tide features are entitled only to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Again, the issue of sovereignty over these features is not within the jurisdiction of the tribunal and is to be resolved by the claimant states themselves in another forum. On the status of the Mischief Reef, or Panganiban Reef, where the Chinese put up the so-called fisherman's shelter in 1995 and has developed into a military base, and Second Thomas Shoal or Ayungin Reef, where the Philippine Navy ship Sierra Madre is moored, these features are low tide elevations that generate no entitlement to maritime zones of their own, are within the 200 nautical mile EEZ and continental shelf measured from the archipelagic baselines from Palawan, and are located in an area that is not overlapped by the entitlements generated by any maritime feature claimed by China. The tribunal also finds that China failed to prevent Chinese nationals from exploiting our living resources and to protect and preserve the marine environment in the West Philippine Sea in violation of the relevant provisions of UNCLOS. And on the archipelagic baselines, the tribunal said the Philippines is entitled to employ archipelagic baselines being an archipelagic state, while China is a territory on the mainland of Asia and cannot meet the definition of an archipelagic state. In other words, China's EEZ and continental shelf measured from the baselines on the mainland cannot extend to the West Philippine Sea. In preparing the case against China, the DFA organized a seminar inviting 5 ASEAN countries to Manila to explain the legal strategy and to invite them to be co-petitioners in this case. Only 3 ASEAN countries sent representatives, but no one decided to join the Philippines in the case. And so the Philippines went alone in this case, and when the arbitral award was released, all the claimant states, ASEAN, and other organizations crafted their diplomacy on the South China Sea around the elements of this landmark decision. First, Indonesia, which has declared that there is no territorial dispute between Indonesia and China, has responded unequivocally, unambiguously, and forcefully to China's claim over Indonesia's oil-rich Natuna Shelf, which is within Indonesia's EEZ, but within the 9-dash lines. President Joko Widodo had stated that, quote, the 9-dash lines that China says marks its maritime boundaries or border has no basis in any international law, unquote. The Indonesian military conducted a 4-day exercise in the South China Sea, deployed 10 naval ships to the Natuna Island and 4 F-16 fighters to Natuna, and mobilized fishermen to the northern Natuna region, backed up by several naval ships. President Widodo even flew to the island to survey the situation. But Indonesia wants to remain as an honest broker in the South China Sea dispute, and so President Widodo said he supports the code of conduct in the South China Sea and also dialogue between China and Japan, China, and ASEAN. Malaysia, as a claimant state in the dispute, has shown its military presence and determination to oppose China's presence in the Lokonya Shoals, especially on the western oil and gas blocks, in Malaysia's EEZ, and within the 9 dash lines in near China's artificial island bases on Subi and Fiery Cross Reef. Malaysia holds the view that the South China Sea should remain a sea of peace and trade. Thus, matters relating to the South China Sea must be resolved peacefully based on the principles of international law, including the UNCLOS. This was one of the statements of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on April 23, 2020. Malaysia's continuous diplomacy in the South China Sea was earlier reflected in the joint statement following the visit to Manila in March 2019 of Malaysian Prime Minister Dr. Mahathir, wherein the two leaders, among other points, emphasized that the territorial and jurisdictional disputes should be settled through peaceful means by avoiding the threat or use of force and in accordance with universally recognized principles of international law, including the Charter of the United Nations and UNCLOS. Vietnam engaged in military confrontations with China on the Paracels in its claims over maritime features in the South China Sea. But China remained in the area and continues with the claim, in fact, now more forcefully, with establishment of a maritime district in the disputed area, with the presence of Coast Guard and paramilitary vessels that has harassed or arrested Vietnamese fishermen who try to continue fishing there. Vietnam's note verbal to the UN Secretary General on March 30 last year echoes the decision in the arbitral award that the maritime entitlements of high tide features in the South China Sea shall be determined in accordance with Article 121, Paragraph 3 of UNCLOS. This is a reiteration of Vietnam's statement to the arbitral tribunal on December 5, 2014, that none of the maritime features referred to by the Philippines in these proceedings can generate maritime entitlements in excess of 12 nautical miles, since they are low tide elevations or rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own under Article 1213 of UNCLOS. And recently, Vietnam was reported to be considering to file a case against China to seek clarity about its resource rights and to develop leverage to stop Chinese interference so that Vietnam can move forward with the exploitation contracts for its offshore gas and oil deposits. The arbitral award has given a clear direction in the defense by coastal states in the South China Sea of their sovereign rights in their maritime zones and on the illegality of the 9 dash lines. The ASEAN has framed the diplomacy on the South China Sea dispute around the arbitral award, such as in the DOC. At the 37th ASEAN Summit meeting in Hanoi on November 12 last year, the leaders reaffirmed the need to pursue peaceful resolution of disputes in accordance with the universally recognized principles of international law, including UNCLOS. The ASEAN leaders warmly welcomed the continuous improving cooperation between ASEAN and China and were encouraged by the progress of the substantive negotiations, including the second reading of the single draft Code of Conduct negotiating text during this pandemic, leading towards the early conclusion of an effective and substantive Code of Conduct consistent with international law, including UNCLOS, within a mutually agreed time. But the controversial provision in the DOC is paragraph 5, wherein the parties undertake to exercise self-restraint in their conduct of activities that would complicate or escalate disputes and affect peace and stability, including, among others, refraining from action of inhabiting on the presently uninhabited islands, reefs, shoals, cays, and other features, and to handle the differences in a constructive manner. Obviously, this paragraph is not effective And so the ASEAN is considering the code of conduct as work in progress. Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines are conducting their respective sovereignty patrols over their EEZs and continental shelf. I recall a cabinet meeting called by then President Nonoy Aquino in Malacanang during the height of the West Philippine Sea crisis, with all the ranking military officers, Coast Guard, fisheries officials, and the DFA West Philippine Sea Task Force, where after discussions with the AFP officers present at that meeting, they proposed that calibrated sovereignty patrols be conducted in the EEZ in the West Philippine Sea to show China that we are enforcing our sovereign rights in our maritime areas. However, President Aquino turned down the proposal, describing it in the words I cannot forget as provocative and incendiary. I understand where President Aquino was coming from, that the Philippines, with the state of the AFP, especially the Philippine Navy and the Air Force at that time, cannot match the capabilities of the Chinese naval ships and militia fishing boats. The response was to equip the AFP, especially the Philippine Navy, Air Force, and the Philippine Coast Guard with the latest equipment. And so we turn, in part, to our alliances with Japan and the United States. With the help of Japan through the JICA, the Philippines acquired 10 new fast patrol crafts for the PCG and 2 long-range vessels, a surveillance plane, and other equipment to enable the PCG to patrol effectively our EEZ and archipelagic waters. Of course, these equipment are for civilian purposes, including search and rescue and relief operations. This strong and mutually beneficial partnership was emphasized in the official visit to Tokyo of President Nonoy Aquino in June 2015, one of the number of visits of the President to Japan, and of President Duterte in October 2016, as indicated in their respective joint statements after the visit, as summarized in this slide. Japan has its own territorial dispute with China over the Senkaku Islands. This and other security issues have been the basis for the ironclad support for the US-Japanese alliance, as both countries have shared security interests. Japan needs security over the Senkaku Islands, situated in the East China Sea, approximately 90 nautical miles north from the Yaeyama Islands in Japan's Okinawa Prefecture. A strategic defense of Japan in the waters off Senkaku Islands calls for a capable defense in the West Philippine Sea against China by the Philippines as a way of keeping the battleground away from Japan's backyard. Thus, the Philippine-Japan alliance is a mutually beneficial relationship that addresses a common security concern. The U.S. commitment to the security of the Philippines was also described by then President Obama as ironclad on the basis, in part, of the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty and the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, a 10-year deal that allows a strengthened U.S. military presence in the Philippines with increased rotation of U.S. military personnel and assistance devoted to humanitarian and military operations. And just recently, President Biden said the U.S. will hold China accountable to follow the rules in the South China Sea, and State Secretary Blinken tweeting, "The United States stands with our ally, the Philippines, in the face of China's maritime militia amassing at Whitsun Reef or Julian Felipe Reef." But the lingering question about the MDT is its Article 4 on the armed attack on the metropolitan territory of either parties or on the island territories under its jurisdiction in the Pacific Ocean, its armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific. The different opinions from academic and political commentators will only heighten the fact that the United States does not explicitly state whether the Philippines' claimed features in the West Philippine Sea falls under the provisions of the MDT, as these features claimed by us in the West Philippine Sea rose after the MDT was ratified in 1951. In the background of the May-June 2012 standoff in the Scarborough Shoal, when the only Philippine-flagged civilian research vessel MV Sarangani would sail out from the shoal itself, but not the Chinese vessel, and the statement of the U.S. on what will be the response of the United States that will trigger the MDT as explained, as discussed by Justice Carpio, I think would resolve that question. The only question now remains is how will it be really triggered? Anyway, the Philippines remains, the Philippines-US alliance remains ironclad with a 36-year-old Balikatan exercises, assistance in military equipment, and other forms of support for our internal and external security. The US, as stated earlier by Justice Carpio, supports the Philippine Arbitral Award, emphasizing adherence to the peaceful settlement of territorial jurisdictional disputes on the basis of international law, such as the UN Charter and UNCLOS. The U.S. has explicitly stated that it does not take any sides with the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. However, the U.S. has underscored the importance of the universal principle of freedom of navigation, which serve as the basis of freedom navigation operations, or FNOPs, of the U.S. Seventh Fleet in the South China Sea. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command had said the FNOPs was to ensure freedom of the seas and build partnerships that foster maritime security. On the freedom of operations, we note the reports that the British Carrier Strike Group will sail to Asia next month, which, according to UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, aims to project UK influence, signal its power, engage with friends, and reaffirming British commitment to addressing the security challenges of today and tomorrow. We are all seeing the current actions of the government in the West Philippine Sea, and that is summarized in the statement of the task force in the West Philippine Sea, as read for us by Attorney Julius, and I don't need to go into that. Of course, we note the statement of President Duterte on the first paragraph of this slide, which then raises a lot of issues of whether the words would be the actions required. I did not go any further on that. However, I support the continued protest notes because it reinforces our stand as a persistent objector to China's actions in our EEZ and continental shelf. The arbitral award makes a number of references to diplomatic protests and notes verbal of the DFA to establish the unequivocal, unambiguous objection of the Philippines to China's violation of international law. As a persistent objector, China's action in the West Philippine Sea cannot mutate into any form of law for all. Now that the ASEAN states have clinged to the arbitral award in their respective diplomatic approach to China on the South China Sea dispute, this should provide consideration to further strengthen alliances with like-minded states such as Australia, France, UK, and Germany. For example, on April 16, 2021, the European Union issued the EU Strategic Cooperation or Strategy for Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, a Council resolution that acknowledged the importance of a meaningful European naval presence in the Indo-Pacific, and that their strategic approach and engagement in the region should aim to secure free and open maritime supply routes in full compliance with international law, particularly UNCLOS, in the interests of all. We need to heighten the diplomacy, our alliances with like-minded states, and the rule of law brand in our rhetoric, with the aim of giving China the perspective to review its narrative on the 9-dash lines. The Philippine foreign policy and diplomatic push for the West Philippine Sea needs a thorough review. There is no continuity in the foreign policy of this administration and could even have a disconnect in the primary goal and strategy. A change in administration sometimes call for an all change in all stations. The Philippines achieved a resounding victory in the arbitral case against China, as highlighted in this presentation, especially on the illegality of China's 9-dash lines. We all need to capitalize globally on our legal victory against China. As what we have done before when we brought Justice Carpio in various fora internationally to talk on the arbitral award. But today, the Philippines will have to contend with the current foreign policy in the West Philippine Sea. Foreign policy is sometimes described as a reflection of domestic policy. The domestic policy of the present administration is very transparent on its close relations with China. And that has led to compromises in our EEZ, its resources and features, our sovereignty over these features, and sovereign rights over the waters in the West Philippine Sea. The Philippines elected this president until June next year, and his foreign policy stays as he is the chief architect of foreign policy. Whatever may be the strategy in the defense of the West Philippine Sea, the Filipinos may need to take a close look on how the Philippine waters should look like under UNCLOS. And this is how, and this is shown in this map. Let me explain quickly each feature. So we have the map of the Philippines here, the exclusive economic zone established under the presidential decree 1599. Then we have the legal continental shelf, which is also 200 nautical miles from the baselines, archipelagic baselines under Article 9522. Contiguous zone, which is 24 nautical miles from the archipelagic baselines. Territorial sea, 12 nautical miles from the baseline. Now, inland waters. Inland waters should be under Article 50 of UNCLOS in relation to Article 10 on bays, meaning that we can, inland waters are those waters in the bay enclosed from the mouth of the bay. And then, of course, let us not forget the Philippine, Benham Rice, the extended continental shelf, and the Philippine-Indonesia exclusive economic zone delimited boundary. This is here. Now, let me also show the Tubataha Reefs Natural Park, particularly sensitive sea area to be avoided. You know, the reason why I'm showing this is because Professor J. Badumbakal and I, as permanent representative to the IMO, prepared the documents that led to the designation by the IMO Maritime Safety Committee of the Tubataha Reef Natural Park as a particularly sensitive area, as an area to be avoided. Why we're showing this is that we can protect our maritime areas through diplomacy, working closely with the UN organizations. Now, going back to the map, we can all imagine that there is a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, 24 nautical mile contiguous zone, the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. Of course, the KAIG under the presidential decree. There are those who hold the view that we do not need a law to define our maritime zones because we already have them under UNCLOS. I take the view that the UNCLOS maritime zones are not mandatory because UNCLOS recognizes the sovereignty of member states to determine or establish under UNCLOS the maritime zones, provided they do not exceed the limits under UNCLOS, meaning 12 nautical miles, territorial sea, 24 miles, contiguous zone, 200 nautical miles EEZ and continental shelf, measured from the baselines. Okay. In fact, there are pending bills in Congress to declare maritime zones, and similar bills were archived at the end of each congressional terms. I call for the legislation of our maritime zones, as shown in this map, in order to clearly establish the reach of our maritime zones based on defined coordinates, which NAMRIA can do, putting definite coordinates on the arcs of the EEZ, continental shelf, contiguous zone, territorial sea, as we have done with specific coordinates on the baselines of the Philippine archipelago. If we do this with our EEZ, we can clearly show where the high seas begin in the South China Sea, because under Article 7 of UNCLOS states the high seas are open to all states, whether coastal or landlocked. Furthermore, Article 58 of UNCLOS states that in the EEZ, all states, whether coastal or landlocked, enjoy, subject to the relevant provisions of UNCLOS, the freedoms referred to in Article 87 on navigation and overflight. As I mentioned earlier, the freedom of navigation is vital to the US, a major component of the naval doctrine that was developed over centuries in the works of Alfred Thayer Mahan, a US naval officer called the most important American strategists of the 19th century and the evangelist of sea power. Mahan believed that national greatness was inextricably associated with a command of the sea through naval superiority and a combination of maritime commerce, overseas possessions, and access to foreign markets that produces national wealth and greatness. Restricting freedom of navigation in the high seas in the South China Sea, if it were done by China because of its 9-dash lines and its claim over the whole of the South China Sea, strikes at the very heart of the US naval policy or doctrine of sea power. The dispute with China over our West Philippine Sea will be with us for some time. But like the virus that is waiting for a vaccine as the cure, our problem with China on the West Philippine Sea would also need the right cure. Before looking for the right cure, we must first hold close to our hearts the inalienable rights in the Philippine archipelago and in the West Philippine Sea as provided in the Constitution in our maritime zones under UNCLOS. The Philippine government itself must continue to listen and respond to the Filipino people's clamor for their government to defend their sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. Public discussions such as this MARLAW Forum and the forthcoming Philippine Bar Association Forum, and even the Senate or House resolutions in the West Philippine Sea are some of the means to deliver the message to the policymakers. Let us all shout out loud of what the government should do to defend our sovereign rights and sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea. Alliances with like-minded nations, diplomacy, and the law, the rule of law, these are the tools in our toolbox when we negotiate to resolve this dispute. We cannot kick this toolbox down the road for another administration or era to solve the dispute. And when could we see a paradigm shift in the diplomatic strategy in the West Philippine Sea? Maybe next year, when the Filipinos decide in the elections. But if we elect new officials who are of the same disposition, attributes, and political makeup as the current, we could see more of what we now have, and in the end, leave nothing for the next generation. It is for the Filipinos to decide next year that, with respect to our sovereignty and sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea, we can demand change or stay with the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Asuke. Very well said. It was great that you provided the antecedents relating to the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea disputes, and it was well noted that part on the alliances that we have with other countries. Indeed, these alliances would be very crucial when it comes to improving the defense capability of the Philippines. Again, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Asuke, sir. Now we will proceed with to the questions posed by the attendees. Hopefully, you could address them, Justice Carpio and Ambassador Asuke. But before we proceed, again, we would like to invite everyone to support and to attend the forum to be hosted by the Philippine Bar Association on the 30th. You see the advert for the event on your screen. Please register and gain more knowledge and insights relating to the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, particularly on the issue on the enforcement of the 2016 Arbitral Award. Now maybe we can go to the questions. Your Honor, Ambassador Asuke, we have basically collated the questions and arranged them according to their respective topics. We would be propounding various questions relating to a common topic. So maybe you could address them as a whole. The first question we have here is, how important is the Maritime Zones Act is the UNCLOS consistent with Philippine laws, particularly the Constitution? What has happened to the Treaty of Paris, the notion of the Treaty of Paris lines being Philippine territory? Also, the president's statement on fishing agreement is against the Philippine Constitution. Isn't the Constitution the highest law of the land? And no statement can refute such law. Those would be the first questions, Your Honor and Ambassador Asuke. Maybe we can have His Honor Justice Carpio to give us comments first.
I will comment on the Philippine territory side. Of course, the Treaty of Paris has a rectangular lines, and it was never the intention of the parties, the US and Spain, that everything within the lines constitute the territory that will be transferred to the US, because the treaty itself says all islands within the lines. It did not say all islands and waters and resources within the lines. So even the US said what was transferred were the islands, not everything within the lines. The lines just indicated what are the islands what were the islands that were transferred. And of course, there was a second treaty, the Treaty of Washington of 1900, because when the Americans arrived here, they found out there were many islands outside the treaty lines. Islands in Batanes, Scarborough Shoal was outside the treaty line. The Spratlys were outside the treaty line. The Turtle Islands were outside the treaty line. So the Americans asked the Spaniards to clarify that the cession included all the other islands that formed the Philippine archipelago. And the Spaniards first resisted until the Americans said, we'll pay you an additional $100,000 in addition to the $20 million that we paid for the Treaty of Paris. And that's why there was a second treaty, which says the cession included any and all islands lying outside the lines of the Treaty of Paris. So everything within the Philippine archipelago, within and outside the lines, were ceded. That's the bottom line. But only the islands. It did not include the waters. And the Americans said this, what was transferred were the islands. And at that time, the territorial sea was only 3 nautical miles. It's impossible that they intended to cede more than 3 nautical miles of territorial sea, because that was against international law at the time. And this is very important. I failed to include this in my earlier discussion, because in the arbitral tribunal, during the proceedings, China submitted a position paper. China said, we are not participating, but this is our position on this issue. And China submitted this position paper to all the judges. And in that position paper, China said, Philippine territory is governed by 3 treaties. First, the Treaty of Paris of 1898, then the Treaty of Washington of 1900, and the treaty with the British on Mapan Island and the rest of the 1930s. Very important. China recognized the Treaty of Washington of 1900. And the Treaty of Washington clearly stated the Philippine archipelago that was transferred, ceded by Spain to the US, included islands outside the treaty lines. And today, China is saying, oh, the Philippine territory refers only to islands within the treaty lines. But they recognize the Treaty of Washington. They're bound by that. That is admission against the interests of China. So China cannot say that our territory is limited to those islands within the treaty lines, because they mentioned, also recognize the second Treaty of Washington of 1900, which expressly says the cession included all other islands belonging to the Philippine archipelago lying outside the lines. And what are those islands lying outside the lines? We go to the official map of the Spanish government at the time. What was the official territory of Philippine archipelago during the Spanish regime? The 1734 Pedro Murillo Velarde map. That is officially the Philippine territory during the Spanish regime. And this is a territory that Spain ceded to the US in the Treaty of Paris and the Treaty of Washington. And China is bound by this because China recognized this. It submitted a position paper that the territory of the Philippines is regulated by those treaties. So they're bound by that. So the question is, what are those other islands lying outside the treaty lines? We will introduce now the Pedro Murillo Velarde map of 1704, which includes the Scarborough Shoal and the Spratlys as part of Philippine territory. Very clear. That's why it's very important. That position paper of China is an admission against interest. You know, the principle in international law is a map cannot bind a country unless it's attached to a treaty. Of course, but there is an exception. And the vital exception is if it is a map produced by the country itself or recognized by the country in another forum, and it binds it. So in the arbitration between Singapore and Malaysia over the Pedra Branca, Singapore introduced a map produced by Malaysia, not part of a treaty, but unilaterally produced by Malaysia. And the tribunal said Malaysia is bound because it made this map itself. It's an admission against interest, even if it was not part of a treaty. And all these historic maps of China during the Chinese dynasties extended only up to Hainan. The southernmost territory of China during the Chinese dynasties was up to Hainan. And China published all of these maps in an official publication, 3-volume publication, published by the People's Republic of China, the Chinese government now. These are the official maps during the dynasties. They're bound by that. It's an admission against interest. So they cannot claim the Spratlys because the Spratlys never appeared in any official map of the Chinese dynasties. And we can introduce the 1734 map because China recognized the 1900 Treaty of Paris, a Treaty of Washington between the US and Spain, where Spain said we cede to the US all our territories in the Philippine archipelago. And of course, the documentation of that is the Pedro Murillo Velarde map. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. How about, Your Honor, and Ambassador Asuke, the point on the Maritime Zones Act? Ambassador Asuke mentioned it earlier during his presentation. And how would this relate to the Constitution and to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea? Basically, the consistency between a Maritime Zones Act and implementing the Law of the Sea Convention and the Philippine Constitution.
Attorney Julius, if I could put back the map, the map that I tried to show, so that at least our audience will be able to take a look again. Now, this is not an official map. Again, let me stress that this is my own understanding of how the map how the Philippines map should look like. Okay, can all of us see this? It's just a part of the slide. Anyway, you're asking whether what is the relevance of the Maritime Zones Law? Well, first, the Maritime Zones Law proposed, it's pending in Congress, and as well as in the other bills that are now archived, will now be based on the will now be based on the archipelagic baselines under our Republic Act 9522, and this is the line itself. All of these are projections. We do not have a law that clearly establishes, except perhaps the presidential decree. As Justice Carpio mentioned, the Treaty of Paris should be covering this box. Now, we have left this, the KIG, under the presidential decree, but we also have to take into account the high tide elevation in the KIG to determine whether we can project the 12-mile territorial sea as discussed in the award under Article 121, Paragraph 3. But it is pointed out that all the features in the West Philippine Sea in this area are high tide elevations that cannot sustain economic life or habitation on their own, and thus not entitled to an exclusive economic zone or continental shelf, meaning it can only have a 12-mile territorial sea. So if we project all of these lines, this will be in accordance with UNCLOS, in accordance with the decision penned by Justice Carpio in Magallona versus Executive Secretary Admita. So this will institutionalize our hold on UNCLOS and the arbitral award. The challenge now is whether NAMRIA will be able, under law, to determine the metes and bounds of these EEZ. Of course, this is already established. This is already a done deal, a done conclusion. The delimited EEZ between the Philippines and Indonesia is already enforced, but we have pending delimitation talks trilateral with Indonesia and Palau, and we have some delimitation talks with Japan here, but it also involves Taiwan. But as mentioned earlier, in the arbitral tribunal and the decision of the tribunal, as well as in the discussion of Justice Carpio, China's maritime zones can only be projected from the mainland, and its EEZ cannot reach this area. And so this should be declared as a high seas if we have this definitely defined under Philippine law. Because if this is high sea, then every coastal and non-coastal states have freedom of navigation, and the freedom of navigation operations of maritime powers will go unimpeded in this area, which we also have to recognize because there is also freedom of navigation in the EEZ, subject, of course, to the limitations under UNCLOS on the EEZ. So I believe it is important for Congress to now consider the law that is pending in their halls to pass this law in order to strengthen our hold on our sovereignty and sovereign rights on the West Philippine Sea and all over the waters of the Philippines, and to globalize and to make people understand that we are complying with our obligations under UNCLOS and the arbitral awards, because this maritime zones, if ever declared, will be in accordance with that arbitral decision and the decision of the Supreme Court, as well as the Constitution of the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Asuke. Going to our next question, we have three related questions. Any applicable solutions or plans prepared to resolve the conflict with China, Vietnam, and Indonesia? Any developments with the steps conducted from our diplomats? Second question, the UN seems to be the remaining peace force to run to. What if the majority of the UN members do not agree to take action against China? And what effect would that have on the arbitral ruling when no peaceful force will enforce it? Lastly, as we discuss these issues, China continues to improve its position in the South China Sea. What can be done to stop them? Your Honor.
Muted.
Sorry, Your Honor, your mic is on mute. We'll try to fix it also.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just answer that portion on the UN because Secretary De Rosario and I have been pushing that we bring to the UN the arbitral award. We sponsor a resolution that China must comply with the arbitral award and put that resolution to a vote. And I believe we will win because we have the US, the EU, Japan, Australia, India, all these big naval powers on our side. They say that China has a checkbook diplomacy, has given aid to small countries. But if you put all the aid of the US, EU, and their allies together, it's much more than the aid given by China to other countries. So the US and EU and their allies have more IOUs to collect from the rest of the world. So I do not think we will lose. And besides, the coastal states, they are the majority in the United Nations, they are worried that their bigger neighbor might seize their exclusive economic zone, just like what China is doing in the South China Sea. They're worried that if UNCLOS will collapse, because if China can claim the entire South China Sea, UNCLOS will certainly collapse, then what will protect them from their bigger neighbors? They will have to spend money to buy warships, warplanes, missiles to protect their maritime zones. And this will divert funds from social services, from education towards defense. And they don't want that. So we will get certainly the majority. Look at the latest voting in the UN. UK was ordered by 100 plus countries to return the Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius. UK got only a total of 6 votes. In the Nicaragua versus US voting, the US at the last voting got only 1 vote from Israel. Only US and Israel voted together. All the rest of the world either sided with Nicaragua or just abstained. This is the same because it is the interest of the world to preserve UNCLOS. And if UNCLOS cannot apply in the South China Sea, UNCLOS will not apply anywhere else in the world. So we will definitely get a majority. So what I'm saying is, but of course, the UN resolution is not binding, legally binding, because it is just an expression of support. Because that is not a legally binding resolution, but very important because that is an expression of world opinion. And world opinion matters. It was world opinion that forced the US to compromise with Nicaragua in that case. And in fact, even Russia had to pay damages to Netherlands in the Arctic Ocean case because it lost in the Arctic Ocean case. And it negotiated to pay half, and the Netherlands agreed because you will lose your prestige, your reputation. You're supposed to be a proponent of a rules-based international order, and China wants to be respected, but nobody respects a country that's seizing an entire sea at the expense of so many countries. So we will definitely win that resolution. It may not be legally binding, but it has persuasive force, and we need the support of the world community. Thank you.
Your Honor. Ambassador Asuke, your comments, please.
Yes, thank you, Justice Carpio and Attorney Julius. I think we really need to conduct an aggressive and full court press on this arbitral award that was won by the Philippines. We need to match the aggressive Genghis Khan diplomacy of the Chinese. You know, when this decision was released, as I mentioned earlier, the DFA organized a series of seminars for Justice Carpio to discuss the details of the arbitral award and explain to the whole world the meaning of this award, not only for the Philippines, but for all countries, especially coastal states. But as I mentioned in my presentation, whenever there is a new administration, things change. There's an all change on all stations if there is a new administration. And so even I recall that when we had the decision, there was instruction to all foreign service embassies to make a full court press, meaning to go out and speak, like what the Chinese are doing in all the forum, to explain the arbitral tribunal decision. It includes talking points, it includes charts, it includes the maps that were shown by Justice Carpio. We were ready to go to that, but the administration changed and things were put on hold. And so all change at all stations. And there is a change in foreign policy that has a different track. So we need to go back to that again. if we need to get global support, we need to conduct an aggressive diplomacy. This is our only tool. As Justice Carpio pointed out, we cannot go into violent confrontation. This is not allowed under the Charter of the United Nations, as well as in UNCLOS. Our only tool is diplomacy, negotiations. But we need to craft an effective strategy and tactics to harp on this decision. I hope that we can bring this message to the current policymakers. If not, let's wait for the next election and the new administration, if we get one that favors our views on the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea.
Thank you, Ambassador Asuke. What exactly do you mean by aggressive diplomacy? Before we go into that question on use of force and war, which we have here from the attendees, what exactly is aggressive diplomacy?
Well, I recall the time, I think there was Justice Carpio was also there when we organized a forum in Tokyo. So Justice Carpio was presenting the decision in the West Philippine, in the arbitral award. And here comes the Chinese third secretary coming up and mouthing the narrative that the 9 dash lines belongs to China and everything. If you will see, it's all in the script. It's all in the talking points. This was done by every foreign service officer of the Chinese government, from the lowest rank up to the ambassador. They speak with one line. But we have not done that. We are going our own different ways. We do not have a unified voice. And that is what we mean by aggressive. To talk with one voice, forcefully identify the different forums or organizations that we can instruct our foreign service officers and even public officials to go there and explain. We need to ramp up global support for this decision so we can have the moral courage to go to the United Nations General Assembly and file all of these resolutions and other organizations. So we can say it's all laway, but that's our only tool at the moment. We need to convince the world through our diplomatic skills and our dedication to our country that we have to defend this. And our only tool to do that at the moment, globally, is the arbitral award.
Thank you, Ambassador Asuke. Now we go to the next set of questions. This is more aggressive. Should our Navy patrol the Philippine Sea? I suppose the attendee meant the West Philippine Sea, and confront the Chinese vessels, including the Chinese Coast Guard. What if this results in a shooting incident? Next, given the premise might makes right, how do we enforce our claims? Is the Mutual Defense Treaty ineffective in the West Philippine Sea? Lastly, what active military or security measures, short of war or gray zone warfare, can the Philippines, with and without the assistance of its allies, take against incursions by the Chinese Communist Party in the West Philippine Sea? Your Honor?
Yes. In the EEZ, there's freedom of navigation on our flight, including naval drills. So when we patrol our EEZ, we're making sure that other countries are not taking our fish, because the fish belongs exclusively to Filipinos. So we have a right to patrol. And the right to patrol is not a provocation. It is not use of force, because it's an exercise of a legal right. If you exercise your right under the law, you are not committing an unlawful act. So we can patrol because we have a right to be there to protect our fish, but there is also freedom of navigation. Other countries, including China, can also sail because there is freedom of navigation. There is no contradiction there. They can sail, we can sail. But if we do not sail and they sail, how do we protect our fish from poaching by Chinese fishermen? So just because we are patrolling our EEZ doesn't mean that we are already going to war. There is freedom of navigation. Now, the US will also conduct naval drills there. That's allowed under UNCLOS. We can join the US in their naval patrols. We can join them in their naval drills. That will assert that that is an EEZ, where there is freedom of navigation in our flight, including naval drills. So it does not mean that if we patrol our EEZ, we are making provocative acts. No, we are exercising a legal right, and the exercise of a legal right is always lawful. It's never provocative. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ambassador Asuke, your comments on those related questions regarding the possibility of a shooting incident in the even war with China if we become more aggressive.
I understand the concern of our fellow citizens about a shooting war with a background on Vietnam and China's aggressiveness. But let me point out, right, we need to take the moral high ground on this by anchoring our actions on the peaceful settlement of disputes as provided for under UNCLOS in the UN Charter. Specifically in the preamble, it says to promote the peaceful use of the sea. Now, our Constitution really prohibits us from going into that area, but we need to use our resources to enforce our rights. We need to show that we are going to defend our rights. I recall the time, as I mentioned there in my presentation, in May 2012, I think, during the standoff of the Scarborough Shoal, when the last Philippine flag vessel moved out of the Scarborough Shoal, we asked Secretary to bring back the ship. But I don't need to go to that because we know what the situation is. Because I think we were trying to avoid any clash. But the reason for that really is more than that. It is our capability to withstand. But we should dissociate ourselves from that concern because we should not be going there. Because if we go to that stage, we are in default of our obligation under UNCLOS, on the peaceful use of the sea, and to the peaceful resolution of disputes under international law, including UNCLOS. We have even made this declaration in the ASEAN Declaration on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. So it brings me back to my earlier position that we need to have an aggressive promotion of the principles that we adhere to under this decision of the Arbiter Tribunal.
Thank you, Ambassador Asuke. For our penultimate question, this is in light of the recent incident at Julian Felipe Reef, and maybe it would be a good opportunity also to clarify the status of Julian Felipe Reef, of the reef. Basically, the question is, what case or cases can we file against China before local and international courts in connection with the Julian Felipe Reef incident?
Well, Julian Felipe Reef is, as I said, within the territorial sea of Gerson Reef. So that's not part of our exclusive economic zone. But China is saying they are just there in Julian Felipe Reef to shelter because of a storm. Their fishing vessels are there. And after the storm, their fishing vessels will go out. In fact, the Chinese ambassador said the West Philippine Sea is their traditional fishing ground. There can be no traditional fishing ground in the EEZ. So we can go back to the arbitral tribunal and say, China is saying that they have a right to fish by tradition, by historic right, in the EEZ of the Philippines. We want a ruling. And I'm sure the ruling will be the same. There's no traditional fishing right in the EEZ. And Vietnam can do that because China is using the same argument to fish in the exclusive economic zone of Vietnam. Also in the exclusive economic zone of Indonesia, China has been claiming that they have traditional fishing rights in the exclusive economic zone of Indonesia. And the Indonesians have been very forceful. They said, you do not have traditional fishing rights in our EEZ. We can ask the Indonesians, we can file a joint complaint, joint action against China before an UNCLOS tribunal. Test this Chinese claim that they have traditional fishing rights in the EEZ of Indonesia and the EEZ of the Philippines. So it can be done. But of course, President Duterte will never do that because he doesn't want to displease President Xi Jinping. So we'll have to wait for the next administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Point well taken. The idea of traditional fishing rights would be quite contradictory to the idea of exclusive economic rights in the exclusive economic zone. Further comments from Ambassador Asuke, sir, on the point? Yeah.
Yes,
Cases we can file.
I think we should match our words, especially that recent statement of the West Philippine Sea Task Force. We should match it with actions. We can say all the words that we want, the statements and everything, but we have to match that with equal action. You recall during the time of President Ramos, we were arresting Chinese fishermen who were poaching in Philippine waters. We jailed them. And I do recall, because I was the executive director of the Maritime and Ocean Affairs Unit, we built 2 prisons for Chinese fishermen who were arrested. We built one in Palawan and one in La Union, I recall. We jailed them. We put them there. And we filed the cases in court. But when the decision became final and executory, and they were really sentenced, the president exercised his powers of executive clemency. And so they were sent back. We have to do a similar action. We cannot just be saying and issuing statements on this. We have to match it by peaceful, aggressive, and legal means. Because our brand in this action is the rule of law.
Thank you, Ambassador Asuke. Interesting point. For the final question, since actually we already passed our schedule, it will be asked by the President of the Maritime Law Association of the Philippines, Attorney Nage.
Thank you, Attorney Julius. I would like to thank our speaker, Justice Carpio, and for articulating to all of us the importance of owning really the West Philippine Sea. That I said that China is not in possession of West Philippine Sea. And of course, to our very own Ambassador Asuke for saying the aggressive diplomacy. So we learned a lot today with those insights from our renowned speakers. But I just have one question because again, our president said that China is in possession of the West Philippine Sea, Justice Carpio, and that admission may be construed against our interests. But again, if he will not withdraw that statement, will the next president withdraw it easily so that it will not be run against our interests?
Well, I am sure if the next president is not the anointed of President Duterte, the next president will withdraw. Will never say, because it's contrary to fact. Factually, as a matter of fact, China is not in possession of the West Philippine Sea. China is in possession of 7 features in the Spratlys plus Scarborough Shoal. But you add the territorial sea of these 7 features
Sorry, I think Justice Carpio got disconnected. Yeah. Okay.
Only Justice Carpio.
Yeah.
Maybe
Sorry, yeah, there's just a technical
Our
issue.
apologies. Ah, there you go.
maybe Ambassador Asuke may Justice Carpio
Justice is back. Yeah.
Yeah, you're back, sir.
Sorry, Your Honor, you were saying?
Yes, I was saying if you add all the geologic features that China occupies in the West Philippine Sea, it's less than 2% of the entire West Philippine Sea. So 98% of the West Philippine Sea is not possessed by China. And that is factual. So I think the next president will not follow President Duterte because it is not factual. And even our own National Task Force on West Philippine Sea, the fact that they can patrol the West Philippine Sea means that China is not in possession. And I'm very happy that they're patrolling it. They're sending whatever assets we have just to show to China, China is not in possession. In fact, that's the subtle message to China and to President Duterte, that China is not in possession. And we should continue this, and all Filipinos should say it to Duterte. China is not in possession because that is a fact. China is not in possession, actually. And besides, you cannot possess exclusive economic zone. How can you possess exclusive economic? You can control, prevent others from entering, but you cannot physically possess it. But China doesn't even control because the US and its allies patrol that area, conduct naval drills there, and we ourselves go there. So we just have to say what's factually correct. China is not in possession of the West Philippine Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. And maybe further comments from Ambassador Asuke regarding, in relation to the question of the president of MARLAW.
Well, I really support sovereignty patrol because now, with all the developments and the resources that we have, we can say that our sovereignty patrol in the West Philippine Sea is not provocative or incendiary, but an enforcement and recognition of our sovereign rights under international law in UNCLOS. As I mentioned earlier, we cannot go into what the people, including the president, fears about situation in the West Philippine Sea. We cannot go that way because all of us will lose. And our only track to achieving our vision and our goal in the West Philippine Sea is to continue hammering on our victory in the arbitral award and our sovereign rights and sovereignty under international law. As Justice Carpio mentioned, there is no sheriff to enforce the decision. But it is us, the Filipinos, and this government that won this case that has the onus to enforce the decision by telling the whole world, hey, listen, this is for everyone, not only for the Philippines. And so really, we have to go that way. It's our only way, and there's no other way for this to be solved. And again, we have to look for the next administration if we want to see something of a paradigm shift or a significant change. Unless, of course, I mentioned that earlier, the unless. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Maybe a short closing statement. Ambassador Asuke, maybe a short closing statement from you.
Well, thank you, Justice Carpio. I do recall the many times we've met on this before I retired from the Foreign Service and the valuable contribution you have given to the legal strategy developed by the Department of Foreign Affairs at that time. Now that discussions are going far and wide here in the Philippines, in all four corners of the archipelago, we really need to speak with one voice now. We really need to galvanize the spirit and the courage of the Filipino people to say, defend our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. It is ours. It's our inalienable right. And we need to keep on harping this so that our voices will be heard and change the foreign policy of this administration, even up to the last few months of its term. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Your Honor, maybe you could give your closing statement as well.
Yes, thank you. I wish to thank Ambassador Suke. Even after he has retired, he has been tirelessly supporting also the West Philippine Sea issue. We have been discussing this for a long, long time. Manila Yacht Club, at the Philippine Embassy in Tokyo and in other fora. And we are really together in this. And we want the Filipino people to be together with us, because this is the only way we can win. We must be on the same page. The entire Filipino nation must be on the same page, because when we are on the same page, there is nothing that can stop us from winning, because we will show to the world that when we defend our maritime zone, we are also defending their maritime zone from possible encroachment by their bigger neighbors. We are doing this not only for us, but for also to protect them also from other countries that might seize their maritime zones. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. That concludes our Q&A. So at this point, we would like to call on our Executive Vice President for his closing remarks. Attorney
Hello,
Pedrito
everyone.
Fritaren.
Hello, thank you, Attorney Yano. On behalf of the Maritime Law Association of the Philippines, or MARLAW, I would like to say thank you, express our thanks to Justice Antonio Carpio and Ambassador Gilberto Asuque. Thank you so much for enlightening us today. And we hope that you will not get tired of MARLAW's invitations. I am very sure that MARLAW will invite you again. As early as next year, I am sure MARLAW will invite you again. And I also want to say thank you to President Nage, the board members of MARLAW, all of the officers, as well as the organizers. Thank you so much for this forum. I hope, I hope we did the good service to all of the people who want to know something, want to know what's happening right now, because this issue is only adding fears to all of the current problems that our country is currently facing. And I also want to say thank you to Mr. Sam Bautista and his company Advanced Developmental Logistics for hosting this Zoom forum. And finally, thank you to everyone who attended. I cannot name all of you, but to the members of MARLAW, all of our fellow lawyers, to the schools. I see a lot of students here from Ames, members of the academe, students and guests. Thank you so much. This forum has also been shared in Facebook, which means it will be there and you can share it and people can watch it at any given time. So please, I invite you to do share this so we can spread the knowledge of the current situation in the West Philippine Sea. And finally, to all of the attendees, if you need your e-certificates to this forum, there is a link there where you just have to answer a short survey, and then you will get it. And finally, sorry, nagsabi na akong finally, but there is also if you want to hear more about this issue, yeah, and there's the attendance link. And if you want to hear more about this issue, the Philippine Bar Association will be having a seminar on April 30 entitled Continuing Challenges in Enforcement of the 2016 Arbitral Award on the West Philippine Sea. So again, on behalf of the Maritime Law Association of the Philippines, MARLAW, maraming salamat po, and thank you for joining us today. God bless everybody.
Thank you, Attorney Fritaren. Again, Your Honor, Justice Carpio, thank you for your insights and for the time. Ambassador Asuque, thank you as well. So before we all leave, may we invite everyone, our speakers, our distinguished speakers, and the